Trippelt välkommen tillbaka säger vi till cheeseburgarnas cheeseburgare. Ja, vi pratar såklart om triple cheese på McDonald's. Lika god som vår cheeseburgare, fast trippelt. Bara på McDonald's.
Upptäck Ford e-Custom, elversionen av Europas mest sålda transportbil. Den har upp till 370 kilometers räckvidd, snabbladdning och finns nu med 4-hjulsdrift. Just nu till Ford Pro Edition-pris från 479 000 ex-moms. Läs mer på Ford.se eller besök din Ford-återförsäljare. Ready, set, Ford.
Get ready Sweden. BetMGM är här. Nu kan du uppleva spänningen från Las Vegas i mobilen. Ta chansen att spela på Bellagio roulettebord eller våra exklusiva MGM-slots. BetMGM. Casino och sport i mobilen. Åldersgräns 18 år. Regler och villkor gäller.
Jag sätter mig till rätta på mitt förstaklassäte i X2000 klockan 21.57 och tänker att det borde finnas en fråga att ställa här. Om att det är på väg att skapas ett nytt Sverige. En landsbygd där de infödda svenskarna drar sig tillbaka till villorna och centrum blir en plats för de nya. Att landsbygden sedan länge ett långsamt slocknande och avfolkat ålderdomshem nu också har blivit en flyktingförläggning, ett asylboende, ett nybyggarland. För vissa en återvändsgränd, för andra platsen där människor börjar om. Så beskrev Jens Liljestrand den dramatiska demografiska förändring som Sverige genomgått och fortsätter att genomgå. Han hade varit ute på föredragsturné och bevittnade en förändrad landsbygd. Han ropade jalla jalla till en taxichaufför som inte talade svenska och gjorde reflektionen att det är han själv, Jens, som är gäst här, inte tvärtom. Denna text var hans sätt att fira nationaldagen 2019 eftersom den texten publicerades dagen innan. Några dagar senare beskrev jag samma förändring utifrån en rapport av Joakim Rist med titeln Global migration, orsaker och konsekvenser som gavs ut på SNS förlag. Det demografiska perspektiv som Liljestrand tagit upp saknades helt i Rists rapport. Han fokuserade på det ekonomiska och menade att invandring inte hade den stora påverkan många trodde. Gemene svensk, som alltid varit för en striktare migrationspolitik än etablissemanget, led alltså av ett slags informationsunderskott. I min text hävdar jag då att det var fel. Det är demografin, inte ekonomin, som är huvudförklaringen till att allt fler väljare i Sverige och västvärlden röstar på partier som vill minska invandringen radikalt, skrev jag. Reaktionerna lät inte vänta på sig. På Aftonbladets kultursida skrev Martin Ågård att jag var hudfärgsfixerad som ens beskrev förändringen runt om i Sverige. Per Svensson, som då var politisk redaktör på Dagens Nyheters ledarsida, skrev att jag passerade en gräns, att det jag skrev var oanständigt. I sociala medier var reaktionerna grövre än så. Vad skrev då Per Svensson och Martin Ågård och mina andra kritiker om Jens Liljestrands betraktelse? Ingenting alls. Om man hyllar förändringen och dessutom har med en passus där man kritiserar Sverigedemokraterna, då är man anständig. Om man däremot beskriver exakt samma förändring men även att den leder till ett ökat invandringsmotstånd, då är man oanständig. Borde inte frågan ha varit om analysen stämmer istället? För det tror jag att den gör. Tror verkligen vänsterliberaler att majoritetsbefolkningar runt om i västvärlden och i Sverige inte reagerar på det faktum att de inom en överskådlig framtid kanske blir minoriteter i sitt eget land? I boken Exodus beskriver Paul Collier vad som anses vara en anständig reaktion hos Europas majoritetsbefolkningar på migrationen. 1. Var inte rasist. 2. Ge plats. 3. Lär dig att lovprisa andra kulturer. Detta är vänsterns och många liberalers attityd. Minoriteters identiteter är skyddsvärda, medan majoriteten ska trycka ned sin egen. I dagens podd diskuterar jag med en av dem som analyserat detta på djupet och som menar att även majoritetsbefolkningar måste få ge utlopp för sina nationalkänslor och även att skydda sin särart. Eric Kaufmann är professor i statsvetenskap vid Birkbeck College vid London University och han har skrivit flera böcker varav den senaste, White Shift, Populism, Immigration and the Future of White Majorities, kom 2018 och är en av de mest intressanta böckerna som kommit på senare år. Du lyssnar på Rak Höger med mig, Ivar Arpi. So welcome Eric Kaufmann to Rak Höger med Ivar Arpi.
Great to be here. Thank you, Ivar.
I'm very happy to have you on because I've read a lot of your books and it's like touched upon some of the most interesting topics, I would say, like shall the religious inherit the earth, and where you speak about how the huge discrepancy in fertility rates between religious and secular people will it have a profound effect. And then you wrote Whither the Child. You actually wrote that before, and how fertility rates are dropping all over the Western world, especially, but also in the East Asian countries. And then you wrote White Shift, and I wrote in 2018, and it made a huge impact. And it was a very distinctive book because it touched upon subjects in a way that I don't think that any other book in the mainstream, so to speak, has done for a while. But recently you've written two pieces which also caused a stir, and I'm thinking, because in the United States, of course, even if you live in Sweden, you can't miss that basically all of the public debate right now is about critical race theory, racism, how racist is the United States really, and you published a study which where you investigated how perceptions of racism is increasing while the actual racism is not. Is that a fair summary of your...
Right. That's right. This is a Manhattan Institute report on the social construction of racism in the United States, where I was interested in political science and in political psychology. We there's a lot of research that essentially argues that people's political inclinations or even biases lead them to see the world in a distorted way. It could be from the right, it could be from the left. A lot of work's been, done on the right more. Were there more people at Donald Trump's inauguration than Barack Obama? These sorts of questions which people on the right will be more likely to get wrong. But there's been less research on left-wing biases, and so this is something that I wanted to do. And part of the reason is because a lot of academics, for example, because they're on the left, will mainly be interested in the right-wing biases, but there'll be very little attention paid to the other side's biases. So typically these biases are worst around the sacred values of a group, which is race and then gender and sexuality to some degree as well. But particularly on race, you see in America, for example, that if you ask a question, is a young black man more likely to be killed, shot by the police, or die in a car accident? The actual statistic is about 10 to 1 more likely to die in a car accident. Now, amongst African Americans who voted for Joe Biden, and the vast majority did, about 8 in 10 thought police shooting was a bigger cause of death than car accident, and only 1 in 10 got the question right.
Really?
And amongst white Democrats who think all Republicans are racist, which is about 2/3 of white Democrats believe that, 7 out of 10 got that question wrong as well. So you have this very strong ideological bias which sort of shapes the way people see the world, whereas the African Americans who voted for Trump were much less likely to get it wrong, and white Americans who voted for Trump, only about 10 or 15% got it wrong. Another study showed something very similar, that the average Democrat, I think the average so-called strong liberal on a 5-point liberal to conservative scale, if you're a 1, most liberal, which means most left-wing, that essentially you think about 1,000 or more unarmed black people were shot by police in 2019. The actual number is probably just under 20. So that kind of gives you an impression of just how distorted people's perceptions are by social media, citizen journalism. You get a clip of a black person being shot by the police, and it's circulated, and that's the way people form their view of the world, rather than looking at numbers and saying, actually, more whites are being killed, more unarmed whites are being killed by police than unarmed blacks. And when you adjust for murder rates and shooting of police, actually, there's no discrimination against black people in shootings, unarmed shootings. And there have been careful studies done of this, but none of that makes it into the media narrative, which is all about white cops shooting unarmed black people, hunting them down. I mean, these sorts of very primitive kind of emotional stories are what drive people's perceptions and not the numbers. So that was kind of the point, really, of that report. And I also showed, for example, that, the opinion on black-white intermarriage, which in 1960 it was something like 95% opposed. Now it's under 10% opposed, and the actual number of interracial marriages has been skyrocketing. So you've had a very much a liberalization of attitudes. The number of police shootings of blacks is dropped 60 to 80% since the late 1960s. So in so many ways, actual racism is much lower than it's ever been. But if you look at the number of people saying, race relations are getting worse, that's really increased since about 2014, from about 40% up to 80% of liberals and Democrats saying that. Not amongst Republicans and conservatives, but amongst liberals and Democrats, you've had this explosion in people saying race relations are worse. There's no evidence whatsoever that would indicate that in terms of racial hate crimes. And incidentally, racial hate crimes, there's a study in Britain that shows that minorities are disproportionately implicated in hate crimes against, say, black people in Britain. I mean, these are all kinds of numbers which just never make it into the conversation.
But why then is this happening? I think you mentioned the statistic that in between 2002 and 2014, around 70% in America thought that race relations were pretty good, and after that it halved to around 35%. So
yeah.
How do you explain that all of a sudden you have like a trend of less racism, more intermarriage, less racist attitudes when it comes to intermarriage, and all of a sudden it seems like things are getting reversed into something much worse, and perhaps, and this is another question, but it will perhaps be how do you say,
self-fulfilling, or
self-fulfilling.
I think that if we think of what is the cause of that change, I would put it, you can point to an event like the Ferguson, Missouri, Freddie Gray shooting, the shooting of an unarmed black person, although there's and the police wasn't convicted, and actually it's very unclear that the police did in fact commit a crime, and this is, but yet there was this kind of rush to judgment. And because of social media, now social media was exploding, clickbait journalism of the kind, that you couldn't rely on advertising anymore. You had to go for eyeballs and clicks. Therefore, you had to be more sensationalist and partisan. So all of those things happened around 2014. And you had what's called the Great Awakening. Matthew Iglesias has this term, the Great Awakening. This is the rise of this kind of progressive left. On university campus, for example, you see a huge increase in no platforming of speakers being disinvited, or people protesting so that speakers aren't allowed to speak. That explodes in 2015. If you look at the content of papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, not to mention BuzzFeed and Vox and these other newer outlets, mention of terms like white supremacy and racism explodes. And so you have just this massive spike in the use of these terms, racism, white supremacy, and so on. And along with that, and along with this new citizen journalism and the social media, the impact of Twitter and the clickbait journalism, all of this sort of seems very highly correlated with people thinking race is a worse problem than they did before. So Zach Goldberg has looked at the survey data. People who are on Twitter, who regularly got their news from BuzzFeed and from the New York Times and from sort of progressive outlets, were much more likely, even than other progressives. They were much more likely to say race relations, racism is becoming a bigger problem. So I think this is a media event, and it is a social media event that is really driving people's perceptions. So perceptions are being skewed not by anything real that's happening on the ground, but simply by cherry picking and viral circulation of sensationalistic events.
Yeah. And then you have the skewing having real effects, perhaps also with the rise of critical race theory in workplaces. And I read about an event where they had separated the workplace in whites and non-whites, and they had different curriculum and different questions. So the white had like a struggle session with their whiteness,
Right.
And the non-whites had a different session.
Yeah.
And you could see how that would not lessen racial tensions, but that will actually increase the perception of that different races are different and they have different interests. So
Yes.
so it will have real effects, perhaps. That's speculating on my part, but you could see tendencies that it will heighten awareness of one's race and the importance of one's race, and that will have effects on the race relations.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting, though. It's important to stress that it is the liberals and Democrats who are reporting worse race relations, that racism is a bigger problem. So it isn't conservatives and Republicans. It's very much concentrated amongst the most liberal, particularly white liberal section of society that are very receptive to this because of the media they consume. Now, the diversity training, the critical race theory. So, critical race theory has been in the universities for a long time. And I remember reviewing an early book on this stuff in the 90s and just thinking, what is this? But it's now migrated, of course, through human resources departments and communications departments into the big companies. I'm just doing a study now. I'm trying to get a handle on how pervasive these kinds of trainings are. It's very much in the big organizations, large organizations. Now, I think there's always been a certain pipeline, but I think it's gotten worse with these events like the Ferguson and George Floyd, and George Floyd really gave all of this stuff a huge amount of oxygen, and it's just led to a surge of activity. So, I see it even in Britain, in the university sector, the number of people saying we must decolonize the curriculum and we have to have, microaggressions reporting, and all these sorts of things there's given an energy by these events.
Kind of hard to decolonize the curriculum in Britain because of the length of the empire, I would say. Just kidding. Yeah. But I recently wrote a book called The Gender Doctrine, and we tracked how it was focused on gender, but you can see how this kind of gender mainstreaming. So you have gender training and certifications, and they're spreading in hospitals and in the state sector, but it's also in the private sector, and like what's been called the woke capitalism. But in Sweden, the diversity training is less important, I would say, than the gender mainstreaming. So it's a difference in importance. Yet it might change, and so recently, like the big Hunter organization in Sweden, they have a paper, and they wrote an editorial where they criticized that 2.5 million crowns were given to science to combat toxic masculinity in hunter teams, like people going out and hunting moose should beware of their toxic masculinity, and the editorial criticized it.
Yeah,
and then that that person was called into a big private company which owns a lots of forest in Sweden, and where hunters were allowed to hunt moose. And they said, like, okay, we're going to check your values if your hunters will be allowed, because if you write editorials like this, then your hunters won't be allowed into our forests. And so, but he brought a camera and he did a great showing of himself. But the consequence was that the hunters were kicked out of Holmen, all their forests. So we have like an example just today of how the media skews sometimes the reporting on this, because our public service, Swedish television, the Swedish broadcasting agency SVT, they did a investigation into how pervasive racism was in at hospitals, and they found that there was very few incidents. But the reporting is that there is a big shadow number. Where few cases are reported, but it's a much larger problem. So they weren't deterred by their own investigation that they didn't find any racism, because they sort of know that there's a lot of racism. Because so perhaps people are afraid then to speak about race. I mean, you can't deny that there's a possibility, but it's a typical media narrative that even if you don't find the cases, then it's because people are afraid to report the cases.
Well, this is sort of the whole philosophy of these critical social justice theories that, normally in science we have what we call the null hypothesis, which means your starting assumption is that your theory is false. So the starting assumption would be racism isn't there. I have to prove that hypothesis that there is no racism, I have to prove it wrong. So the default assumption is that there's nothing there. That's the way science operates. Now, what they've done is they've flipped it around and they've said the default assumption is racism is there, and unless we find overwhelming evidence that it's not. But of course, you can never prove anything 100%, right? So they've inverted the whole scientific pyramid, and so it's completely shoddy. And that's what critical race theory does as well. Is the
question is, how did racism manifest in this situation? That's the question you should ask. Right. I think that's a quote from I don't remember the author, but that's like how you begin the questioning.
Yeah, so you start with the dogma, and then it's all about proving, right? So it's like, where are the signs of the devil and of God? That is essentially the way they reason. And if you speak against it, of course, you are a racist or a sexist or whatever. And so, in the sense, they've got you. So it's not a free conversation. It's essentially a moral game, a dance. But yeah, I think this is a very similar kind of problem, that you have this ideology, which I call left modernism, which is a sort of blend of identity categories, which was always a traditional concern of liberalism, rights for Catholics in a Protestant country. And then it became, rights for women and minorities and gays and everything, which was all about equal opportunity and equal treatment. So that was from liberalism, but then it was grafted onto the victim-oppressor worldview of socialism, radical revolutionary transformation. And suddenly it's not about class anymore, but it's about identity-based revolution. Identity-based redistribution. And it's maybe not even economic redistribution between identity groups, but it's psychological, emotional, self-esteem redistribution. And so this is sort of the new ideology that we're living through, and it's conquering all the large organizations increasingly. And it's really, I suppose we've never seen effective opposition to this idea, I would argue, because I don't think it's as new as people say. I think it's been there since, in large measures, since the late 1960s. If you look at the student revolts in say, on American campuses, the student occupations, they'd make demands like every black student be admitted to the University of California, Berkeley, or you must hire 50 black professors. I mean, all of these demands, largely, many of them were acceded to. Very few of them were resisted. And the hope was, eventually they'll go away. But no one really came up with a proper defense of the existing system. And so I don't think there ever has been a proper defense. And what's happened is these people have gotten bolder and more numerous and more influential as they've gone deeper into institutions, into positions of power. And now we're in a crisis where they're really threatening to take over and take your people's liberties away. And only now, I think, are people realizing, no, there has to be a root and branch confrontation with this ideology.
When you say that they become more numerous, I think one criticism that I've faced when I've argued about this, and that we should fight back for academic freedom and fight back against this ideology, is that they don't constitute a majority, and I would say that in the positions of power, in the elites, in the establishment, I would say that they are, if not a majority, they are so strong, have such a strong voice and wield such power, that even though the population on a whole is not represented by them, they have an outsized power if you look at their numbers. So, and you wrote about this also. You came out with a study about academic freedom and how political discrimination is happening especially against conservative voices. And you state that people on the right wing also tend to discriminate against people on the left wing, but it's a question of numbers, because there are so few right wing academics that they have no power to discriminate, almost. So this ties into that. Like, what kind of information are we receiving from the academic institutions? And because the knowledge production is happening and students are going there. So could you summarize your study?
Well, yeah. So really, I did a study of the U.S., UK, and Canada, and we had, the UK study, we had 820. The U.S., it was sort of over it was probably a similar number, slightly higher, 1,100 in the U.S. and maybe 300 in Canada, 400. But yeah, essentially two main themes. One is this idea of punishment or being canceled. How much support is there for that? How much are people experiencing that? And the other is political discrimination and bias. So on the first, for example, 1 in 3 American PhD students and academics were conservative. Of the conservative PhD students and professors, 1 in 3 had experienced either being disciplined or threatened with discipline for things they'd said or written. So that's 1 in 3. This is not a few no-platforming incidents. So people will often say, well, it's a couple of incidents a year or even 50 incidents a year, but there are 1 million academics in the US. So what's a few incidents, right? So I don't agree with their view that it's no big deal, but let's grant them that. Well, the problem in a way is when you're talking about 1 in 3, you're now talking about a vast number of people who are being threatened. Then you turn to, so that's punishment, but then which leads people to be censored. But then you have the more indirect, soft authoritarianism, which is around discrimination. So 1 in 3 British academics would not hire a known supporter of the Leave side in the Brexit referendum. 4 in 10 American academics wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter for a job. So you're now already looking at...
And even higher. It was interesting because it was 45% in Canada who wouldn't hire a Trump supporter. And, and Trump, he wasn't running. He wasn't the president in Canada. So
Canadians get saturated with American politics, I know, because, as a Canadian. But I essentially, if you're talking about 4 in 10, if they find out you're a Trump supporter, you're not going to get hired. I mean, these academic jobs have, 200, 150 applications to every job. The slightest whiff of anything could disqualify you. So, of course, people are going to stay in the closet. So you have this massive discrimination happening. Now, it's, of course, worth saying that most academics are in the 60% and they're not discriminating. But still, if we had anything like that for race and gender and sexuality, I mean, this would be an enormous scandal, as it should be. But somehow when it's just politics and ideology, it's seen as okay. No problem. We're allowed to discriminate. Similar, by the way, this is not the only study. There have been about 3 or 4 of them that have looked also at would you discriminate in accepting a paper for a journal, for a grant application, for a promotion application, and they're all finding something between 15 and 50% discrimination against conservatives. Could be conservative, could be right-leaning, could be Trump voter, whatever it is. So you've got this very high level of discrimination, and not only that, even as early as the master's degree level, students are aware that academia, if they're conservative, they're aware it's a kind of hostile environment for their beliefs. And so that leads them not to select to become an academic. So I've showed that as well in one of the studies. I mean, because if you ask conservative academics in the U.S., is your department a hostile environment for your beliefs? 7 out of 10 say it is, not as opposed to a supportive environment. If they're asked, do you self-censor in your research, teaching, and discussions? In the social sciences and humanities, 75% of British and American conservative academics are self-censoring. So this is and there have been other studies that show the same thing. So you've got this monoculture that's reproducing itself as essentially a closed system, closed to anyone who is outside the orthodoxy. And especially if you want to touch any hot button issue around race, gender, and sexuality, or even something that can be tied indirectly to race, gender, and sexuality. If you want to question the value of quote unquote indigenous knowledge, this idea that traditional indigenous beliefs should have an equal standing and be mainstreamed into the curriculum, that somehow you become an awful racist. So this is the level of...
Yeah, you should decolonize your sense of rationality. Yeah.
So these institutions, these kind of elite, there's a couple of things going on. If you take academics, most of them don't support cancel culture, dismissing professors with controversial views. Only about 10% of academics typically.
So that's the hard authoritarian.
That's the hardcore, 10%. Yeah. But then you have another 40 to 50% who they're not supporting dismissing, but they're also not opposing it. So they're sort of like, well, I'm unsure, I don't know. So you have this group of 50%, 40%. So now you've got the 10% of nutcases, and then you've got 40 to 50% of people who are not standing up against it. Now, if you even take the remaining 40 to 50%, a certain percentage of them will be scared to speak up because they may think that they're going to be pigeonholed as a racist. And I've got numbers on this too. So if you put those three together, the hardcore 10%, the people who are pulled both ways by their values, progressive values, but they like free speech, so they're not going to stand up to them. That's another 40%, let's say. And then you've got another chunk of people who are scared. So by that time, you're at a majority. And so anything these people want, they get. And that's the situation that we're in many of these large organizations.
So when you speak about this and you say that they are getting, they get a stronger voice over time, and now we're approaching a point where they are taking over, the critics of that hypothesis, so to speak, will point to it's only 10%.
Right.
But so they will exclude all the social dynamics of the people not speaking up. And one of the things that when we wrote Genusdoktrinen, me and my co-author Anna-Karin Windham, we did over 100 interviews with academics in Sweden about this. Are they afraid to talk about these issues, and how are their criticisms being? How are the institutions responding to them? And we had a very hard time getting people to do it in their own name.
Right.
A majority wanted to be anonymous. So of course we investigated the cases and we tried to interview both sides.
Okay.
So we interviewed the institutions, we interviewed the academics. So we tried to get and the students. So we tried to get all the different levels of it. But we weren't believed because we were accused of anecdotal how do you say,
Yeah,
anecdotal?
just cherry picking anecdotes. That's the
Yes,
exciting
yes.
anecdotes. That's the
Yeah, and there is some ground perhaps for that criticism, but then one of the papers, university papers from Gothenburg University, they didn't believe it, so they wanted to do a questionnaire to their academics, like, is there a culture of silence around these issues?
right.
But then they had to write that most of the people who we asked to participate in this questionnaire didn't want to do it because they were afraid of reprisals.
Right.
So it's like a culture of silence, and also my co-author, she's at Gothenburg University in the education department. So she received an email from a professor who said, like, I'm so thankful for what you're doing, and it's like getting a whiff of fresh air into the academic institution and in the university, and so I just wanted to like mail you and with encouragement, and my co-author responded like, oh, thank you very much. So maybe we could grab a lunch or something when the COVID crisis recedes a little bit. And she said, no, I don't want to be seen with you in public. I've seen the actual email, and it's like picture perfect of what the problem is.
Yes. Yeah. It is astounding. The only point I would make is I think there are two issues. One is the fear, but the other is a genuine ideological problem. Like a lot of academics, 40 to 50%, are genuinely cross-pressured between their belief in the social justice ideology and their belief in academic freedom and not firing people. So it's even before you get to the pure issue of being scared. It's not the case that there's an overwhelming majority that are against this stuff and that believe in free speech and academic freedom, and it's just that they're scared. In fact, if that were our only problem, I think we could maybe get around it. The problem, in a way, is it's not 90%. It's more like 40 to 50% in the university that are against this progressive authoritarianism. I mean, against it to the point of we being willing to oppose it. A lot of them don't know what they think, and they're torn. And that's a big problem. So it's also, I think the ideological battle of ideas is somewhat more important than simply people being scared. But of course, the fact people are scared tells you something about the power of this ideology and the way it's been able to stretch the definition and meaning of terms like racism and sexism grotesquely out of all proportion to what they actually mean. So that saying master bedroom or you're so articulate to a minority person becomes racist. So essentially they are able to innovate, and whatever they want to call racism is racism, more or less.
Yeah.
They have to just jump around, hopping around and abiding by the hoops that they're setting in front of you.
Yeah, I think Jonathan Haslam has a term for it, like concept creep. It's
concept creep.
Yeah, like mission creep is that we just want to topple Saddam Hussein, but then you stay for 10 years and you try to instill democracy and freedom. And in Afghanistan, we just want to get rid of the Taliban, but you stay for like 20 years. But then like concept creep is like, okay, racism is that you have. It used to mean that you think that people of a different color, different race, ethnicity were inferior. But now it's the things you bring up. It's like you correct language. And it's the same in Sweden. If you, for example, what's proper Swedish? So if you have a strong accent because you don't speak proper Swedish because you're an immigrant, then that's racist now to cultural racism, to imply that it's not proper Swedish.
Right.
Because now it's an accent of Swedish, so to imply that it's not proper Swedish becomes an act of racism. So you have this expanding definition of racism and sexism, as you say, and then almost everyone can go foul on the border to become racist all of a sudden.
Yeah, because this is sort of social death for somebody to be accused of this. And because these are the sacred values. I mean, in a way, this religion has a totem pole. I think if you think of it as a totem pole with race at the top, gender and sexuality a little bit lower down, and then things like being fat and disabled a little further down, the ones that are really sacred are up near the top, particularly race. And so you want to, if you're a preacher innovator in this religion, you want to try and attach as much as you can to race, because that has the highest symbolic sacredness, right? So anything you can airbrush with that racist term, you can knock somebody down by using that and push yourself up. And so this is kind of, and I sometimes have a one-sentence definition of woke, which is the sacralization of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. In a sentence, that's what woke means, which is basically these things are sacred. Therefore, anytime you criticize even a policy designed to help such groups, even if the policy is actually harming those groups, such as I think the BLM protest marches had a very negative effect on African Americans. But regardless, if you were to say something negative about the Black Lives Matter movement or say something negative about affirmative action, you're going against anti-racism. So you must be a racist, right? This is the Ibram Kendi definition of racism. And I think that's the way that they play this game is by they expand the definition of racism to include all of these other things. And once you push back against any of them, you become accused of racism by extension. So it's a sort of automatic defense. There's no need to actually argue and have a point that's grounded in evidence. You just have to sling an accusation that somebody's a racist or a sexist, and it's end of conversation.
When you wrote White Shift, that was a very, very interesting read, and it started a really, I'm not sure if you're aware, but it started a really big debate here 2 years ago now. Because 2 years ago, I wrote about, there came out a report that said like, oh, if we just have a way of making immigration more economically positive for the country, then people will see that it's positive for them. And so I responded and said that it's not just economics. It's also demographics, and I made an example of from a city or a small town, which I visit frequently, and it's the demographics of the town has shifted rapidly in just a few years' time. And I described that, and I said that this is also what's driving the anti-immigration sentiments in the population in Sweden and elsewhere. A very rapid demographic transition. And not really an integration or assimilation, but just like more people come from other countries moving into cities and changing the outlook of the city very, very, very rapidly. And I got a very angry response, to say the least. But the interesting thing was that just before that...
Nu kraschar den igen.
Nu kan du ringa Albin på Elgiganten Företag.
Nej, men jag behöver bara rensa ut lite filer.
Nej. Ring Albin.
Nej, det är lugnt. Nej. Daniel, vad gör du?
Nu måste du ju ringa Albin.
På Elgiganten Företag ställer vi upp vad som än händer. Det gör oss till hjälpen du vill ha, inte bara behöver.
Under miljontals år har djur utvecklat sofistikerade parningsritualer. Fåglar dansar, vargar ylar och Oscar går in på Amazon för att förbereda sin date night lasagne till King. På Amazon hittar han levande ljus, lyxiga vinglas till fyndpris och en extra tandborste utifall att. Date night får det att hända. Hitta det på amazon.se.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
Left-wing liberal writer had described the exact same thing. He was out on the countryside in Sweden and he met a taxi driver and he said "Jalla jalla" to the taxi driver, and he said that he was now the guest in this countryside of Sweden. Swedes were the ethnicity of yesterday, and immigrants were the ethnicity of the future. And he was very positive.
Oh, really?
Whereas, he was very positive. And this was great, and it was fantastic.
Right.
And I described the exact same thing a few days later, or just one day later, or something like that. And I got a very angry response.
Right.
So I was thinking about this, that when I read your book, because you should always have like a positive. If you have a positive, it's okay to describe demographic change and increasing diversity if you applaud it, if you think it's great. But if you say that, I think in my text I didn't even say that it was something negative. I just said that this is driving the what you call right-wing populism or nationalism and anti-immigration sentiment in the population.
Yes.
But that was enough. That was negative enough.
And yet it's unarguable. I mean, we did an article, myself and a colleague, Matt Goodwin, where we had looked at several hundred academic papers that had investigated this question. What's the link between demographic diversity and change and anti-immigration sentiment or populist right voting? And in almost every case where we have a measure of rapid, change over time, essentially wherever you get rapid ethnic change, increase in anti-immigration sentiment and increase populist right voting. So it's more or less the case, and it's pretty much the case that whenever you get these rapid changes, you're going to get a backlash. It's just empirical social science. It shouldn't be controversial at all. And I think it's recognized, if you write it in a suitably academic way, with a suitable tone, in an obscure academic journal, people will accept it. But I think part of they were saying, oh, how can you comment on this and imply that it's a negative thing, right? So anything that's got a value judgment. But of course, this is increasingly the debate of our time, and it is, again, the academic literature would show quite clearly that economics is not particularly personal, whether my income goes up or down or whether I've lost my job. That has very little to do with immigration views. Immigration sentiment is largely either about ideology. It's generally tied heavily to ideology and psychology. And when you get larger numbers, the people who are psychologically and ideologically disposed to want less start to care a lot more about immigration. So it's, they already wanted less, but it was issue number 5, 6 after healthcare and the economy. Now it's issue 1 and 2. And if you look at the Eurobarometer survey data between 2014 and 2016, you can see immigration shoots right up to 60% of people saying it's the number one issue. And once that happens, the populist right parties are all rising generally. There's been academic papers on this show a very clear relationship, and it shouldn't be controversial at all. Of course, the question then becomes, well, normatively, what do we make? Is it defensible to say actually countries have a right to regulate the pace of ethnic change? And I make the case that I think it is defensible, that in any population you've got a group of people that think change is exciting and stimulating, and you've got a group of people who think that change is loss. You have a group who think difference and diversity are again something stimulating, and then you have a group that think difference and diversity are disorderly. The people's preference for one or the other is like preferring, a Mondrian painting to Picasso. I mean, it's very much a taste. Whether you like this diversity, high diversity, or great or less diversity, more homogeneity. And it's heavily heritable. It's something like 50% heritable. So Jonathan Haidt has done these experiments where you show people orderly dots or messy dots on a screen. And again, there's a link there between your psychology, your ideology, and the way you view these dots. Yes, something very basic. So what you're getting then is the part of the population that wants things slower, that wants things more orderly, is rebelling against the fast change, high diversity. And, I think people on the progressive left think it's just a matter of teaching them, and it's just a matter of they're blank slates, and whatever you you inscribe on that blank slate, it'll be what they believe. And it's just not the case. And that unwillingness to sort of face up to the fact that, in fact, there is deep-rooted opposition amongst, not everybody, but amongst a significant share of the population. And in a democracy, the whole point is you try and find an accommodation between these groups. But their insistence on seeing this as a black and white issue, you're either an open person or you're a narrow-minded bigot, instead of fast or slower, which is shades of gray. It's not a black-white situation, it's shades of gray. We have to meet in the middle. But again, because these values are seen as sacred, because it touches on race, which is the sacred value in the left modernist belief system, immediately that leads to a desire to cancel. Oh, you've transgressed the sacred. You must be excommunicated. That's sort of the knee-jerk kind of response.
And you've also moved from defined as a political issue where you can discuss sort of levels of taxation or something like that. That used to be like the big divide in Sweden in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, like taxation and the class issue. I mean, it was the same in most Western European countries. And now those issues seem all like small compared to this, because you've moved from the political debate into a religious debate almost.
Yes.
And then the comparisons started become sort of like how have Protestants and Catholics coexisted in Europe? That's the comparison, because it's very hard to find accommodation between having controls on immigration if that means that you are violating a sacred value. And on the other hand, it's very hard to accept open borders policies or more generous if you feel like it's violating a sacred value of unity.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I think what's happened, of course, is that the populist right parties across Europe have done better and better, and the center right, and in some cases the center left parties have said we have to take on board the democratic will of the voters, and they have started to talk about immigration. I think Sweden is a good example of that. Whereas it would have been a complete taboo prior to 2014, 2015, and now, it seems as though it is something that people are willing to talk about. And that has happened in high politics. But on the other hand, you find situations like the US where the woke penetration of the Democrats now is to such an extent that they cannot talk about border enforcement and deportation anymore. The way Barack Obama did in 2014, for example. Barack Obama was very much open about deporting, controlling the border, everything like that. Now Biden can't do that. So the border is essentially not being controlled. And this is going to be a big issue if this continues. Because if you're an illegal immigrant, now is the best time to be making an asylum claim, absolutely, right? Because while there isn't a will to deport, you can simply turn up, go to your immigration hearing, and then filter into the country. And there's no ability in a party that's been captured by these sacred values to control a border anymore. It's very hard for them to legitimate. So Kamala Harris went down to Guatemala, I think it was, and said, "Oh, don't come." And then she was criticized by the progressives, and they, how can you say that? That's racist.
Yeah, and it's in Sweden we have it's strange because recently there was a report from a state committee called DELMI, the Delegation for Migration Studies, and they did a critical discourse analysis of the editorial page where I worked at Swedish Svenska Dagbladet, which is the second largest daily newspaper in Sweden, and Göteborgs-Posten, the big paper in Gothenburg. And they basically found out that we were normalizers of racism and xenophobia, and also borrowed or wholly partly or wholly borrowed from far-right extremists. But at the same time, they only studied like 43 editorials and ignored what happened from 2015. They studied us from 2015 to 2020 and ignored everything that happened. But in the same time period, you have like the government saying we have a system collapse in 2015. Like we had the Minister of Finance saying that. And we don't come here, she told people.
Right.
But it's sort of strange because at the same time, people don't really, because Social Democrats and the left wing, they are the good ones. So they don't really want to take in that it's actually the government, the left-wing government, are saying stuff that we think are racist.
Right.
So they attack the proxies so that they hope the left-wing government and left-wing politicians will get the memo. Like, if you keep on this, we will attack you like we're right now attacking right-wing people with who are using the exact same rhetoric as you are. So it's sort of strange because it's like the left-wing modernists in your vocabulary are not acknowledging what the shift in the government rhetoric and the government policies.
That's interesting because, like in other places, you will tend to get the progressive wing attacking often their own party on Twitter. And so, I mean, the progressive wing and the Democrats, for example, are very vocal whenever they feel that the sacred is being violated, like with this Kamala Harris. Or sometimes they might stay silent sometimes, but generally they will make their views very strongly known these circles. And so I have a kind of theory that this is making left-wing, the left-wing parties that succumb to this are becoming unelectable. And if you look at the way the left has collapsed across Europe, some of the worst election results since the war in country after country after country. And I think part of this is they're simply unable to stand up to their own woke warriors who are pushing them in these very unpopular directions that people don't want. Instead of talking about the working class and the poor, they're talking about these woke issues and following these trendy fads. So ultimately, it's going to bite them more. Now, in the U.S., because there's a large, you've got significant voting blocks of African Americans, lesser degree Hispanics and Asians who are kind of shifting now, but to some degree you can get away with these coalitions of white liberals, white progressives plus minorities. That works better, or at least it might work for some presidential election. It won't work for the Senate, for example, or anything that's based on territory, but it will work possibly for a presidential election, but it doesn't work in Britain and in France and the Netherlands. So I think they are ultimately shooting themselves in the foot. But of course, the power, no one can stand up to this rhetoric. It's very hard. Even saying no to defund the police was a big step for Joe Biden, for the leader of the Labour Party here to stand up to that, which is, of course, you want to talk about costing Black lives. I mean, that stance has probably, that and the associated mayhem associated with these marches has cost probably on the order of 5 to 10,000 Black lives have been. The exact number is going to be very, very difficult to come up with, but nobody is taking responsibility for this.
Because like the figure to compare, if it's you used the figure of like the number 20 black men killed by police,
unarmed.
Unarmed. And if you count how many black people are killed by other black people in the rundown housing projects and ghettos, it's a huge number. I mean, it's when we talk about, we have a huge debate in Sweden now because we are number 2 in Europe when it comes to gun violence and kills.
Okay.
After Kosovo. So Sweden is number 2 after Kosovo, where they have like a regular ethnic cleansing between Serbs and Kosovo Albanians, and Sweden number 2. But the numbers are laughably small when you compare to just like Baltimore or Chicago. I mean, you could take Chicago has more murders than the whole of Sweden. I mean, it's a huge difference. But that doesn't really come up in the debate. If you talk about Black Lives Matter, it's not those Black lives. It's just the 20.
Right. The Black lives only matter if they're taken by white people. I mean, that is essentially the truth. I mean, so, for example, there was a study done, which was, in fact, came out in Vox of all play, which was kind of astounding. I mean, they were sort of saying, the cities that had a Black Lives Matter march, look, they had a somewhat smaller number of black men killed by police. It was a few hundred. But they had between 1,000 and 6,000 more murders. So in other words, anywhere that had a Black Lives Matter march, controlling for everything else, had a 10% increase in murders, which disproportionately black people, the victims. So, and this is all before the George Floyd and the crime spike that we've seen since then, which is, I don't know what the number is going to be in terms of excess black lives lost as a result of the withdrawal of policing, the end to proactive policing, stop and search, and these sorts of things. The police are just demoralized. They're not doing these things. Plus the mayhem with these riots that have caused billions of dollars worth of damage and probably blighted these minority areas maybe for a generation. That's what happened in the 60s. These areas were blighted for a generation. What is the knock-on effect going to be on young black people growing up in these areas now without investment, without, nobody's taking any responsibility for this. They just want to sort of, they're back to their keyboards. They've done their marches, which is mainly better off, disproportionately white people marching in these things. They've washed their hands of it, and now they're back. But yeah, there's no one saying, what can we actually do a proper assessment of the positives and negatives of this movement. And in fact, when you had, I think it was David Shore, who was a Democratic strategist, who tried to sort of say, here's this black academic who's done this work that shows that violent protests tend to hurt the left, hurt the Democratic Party. He was canceled. He was fired from his position just for tweeting out an article by a black academic making this point about violent protests. So yeah, it's so far from any kind of scientific reality.
Well, one thing you did with the White Shift, the book White Shift, that you started discussing demographics and race, and not in just you didn't just condemn those. You got into that now in the conversation, but we do tend to talk about in Sweden and in Europe about the demographic challenge that we have, because we are giving birth to, the fertility rate is dropping, so we need to replenish the workforce, and how are we going to do that? And it's totally fine to say that we need a large migration to our country to replenish the workforce. That's you can talk about the demographic change that way. But when you say that we have a demographic challenge and we want to, we don't think it's good, and we don't want migration, for example, but it's a problem, then you're getting into dangerous territory. And what you did with White Shift was that I think that's why people you received criticism here in Sweden, perhaps unbeknownst to you, but that you were peddling the white genocide, the population great replacement theory, and that was what the White Shift was all about. So I really wanted you to perhaps say what you think about that criticism.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good example of concept creep, where people will misrepresent and stretch the meaning of what you're saying to mean something else entirely. I actually talk about the Great Replacement theory, white genocide theory in the book, quite a bit of detail. So it's interesting that demographic change, the idea that say the U.S. is becoming a majority non-white society, if that's written about by a progressive and they say, look, it's becoming majority non-white, the Browning of America, then that's seen as, that is a kind of, you could argue that is sort of great replacement thinking. If you wanted to, they're drawing attention to these ethnic shifts. However, if it's done, say, on the conservative side, and people say, look, the U.S. is going to become majority non-white, that's then seen as alarmist, right? So it's the same facts.
White supremacists.
One side is now interpreted people sort of interpret it through this lens of alarmism and great replacement, and the others and white genocide, and the other side is sort of, oh, that's just being positive. So yeah, I agree with you that it's very disingenuous. I mean, there is something. I mean, the great replacement argument has a number of layers. One of them is that there's some kind of plot. Usually, Jews or George Soros or some kind of globalist actor is orchestrating this in order to wipe out the white race. I mean, that is sort of essentially the argument. It has an anti-Semitic angle to it. So there's a whole bunch of different layers to that proper, full-throated far-right conspiracy theory, which is real. That does exist. And I actually got a lot of, again, unbeknownst to my Swedish critics, I'm sure, if you go onto the far-right websites, there'll be a lot of criticism about me, not just because I'm kind of Jewish and have some not, Chinese and Latino in me, but it's also that, that I'm trying to abolish the white race through intermarriage. So yeah, I mean, everyone picks and chooses, but I think there is a point in the sense that there is a question about ethnicity, and I mean, this is a key concept, this idea of ethnicity, and that majority groups have it as well as minority groups, and so. Whereas progressives will see minority ethnicity as fantastic and maintaining their identities as tremendous, the majority group it's seen as toxic if they try and maintain an identity or have an express an ethnic identity. And so I argue in the book, I say, well, this makes no sense. It's simply unequal treatment. So this is one of the reasons why the Great Replacement, the conspiracy theory works, is because they will take something that is true, which is that majority and minority groups are not treated equally in terms of whether they can express an identity. It's very clear that these are not treated the same way. And then they'll sort of build upon that. So once people see that claim, they'll say, yeah, that actually is true. And then based on that, they lead them down the path towards, well, it's George Soros and Jews and whatever.
Globalists.
It is important, I think, to take that on, and I think there's no actual proper reason why members of majority ethnic groups shouldn't express an identity. Now, what I say is, however, there are two different types of identity that Jonathan Haidt talks about. One is you have an identity, you're just proud of your traditions and of who you are, your history, and whatever. What he would call common humanity form of identity. It's not about hating anyone else. The other form is, oh no, I am Irish, and I define being Irish as hating the English, or I define being Hutu hating the Tutsi, or whatever it is. That is a common enemy form of identity. Now, I think what's happening in the West is we have the left modernists who are trying to encourage minority groups to have a common enemy form of identity based on being a person of color and against white oppression, white supremacy. It's anti-white. In fact, most minorities don't have that identity. They're just proud of their own group and traditions and whatever. And actually, the progressive left wants them to be more angry and oppositional. The whites, on the other hand, their attitude is even a common humanity form of identity should be suppressed, should be seen as toxic and taboo, and you should seek to outgrow that and be a cosmopolitan. That view, which I call asymmetrical multiculturalism, so ethnicity great for minorities, terrible for majorities, actually can be traced back to the 1910s in the US. So it goes a long way back. This idea of being against your own culture, but loving the exotic minority culture and wanting them to preserve themselves and not to assimilate. That's a very old reflex, but it's become more intense recently. And it's completely hypocritical and has no sort of basis in consistent logic and theory. But it's what we're living through. And so I guess, but now, of course, I think that when it comes to, you don't want to have race essentialism, believing that you're a pure race. And what's important with ethnicity is it's actually a subjective belief in common ancestry, collective memories and traditions. And so in theory, that's open to, and I think it is open to blurring of the boundaries through intermarriage and people assimilating into these groups. So the subjective matters more than the objective features like skin color or whatever. It's about a subjectivity.
And that you can see that in, I think they banned some forms of DNA tests in Turkey. because like, Family Finder and Family Tree DNA, all these, when you can find out your ancestry, because the test results came up and show that they are Anatolians, but their national myth is that they're Turks, but the DNA shows something else.
Yes.
So there's a very small admixture of Turkish immigrants, but their identity is that they are Turkish. It's not that the one thing is true and the other is false. It's just it shows that things happen, and you can get an identity which is not based on what your skin color is. Or, I mean, when Swedes immigrated to the United States. They were not always seen as white in the beginning of the 1800s. I mean, and you can find sort of quotes about Swedish people and Scandinavians, which it seems very strange today, because the white identity has expanded so much. And you bring this up in White Shift as well, how the WASP identity of the United States expanded and became, or it was abandoned almost, and it became white identity and integrated more Europeans into that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who had the quote about Swedes initially, but I think that's right. Yeah, so you have sometimes you get the boundaries being redefined like that, from Protestant to include Catholics and Jews, or at other times it's simply the case that, say, you may just get intermarriage into the group, and someone who is part, say, ethnically Swedish but who identifies as a Swede would be accepted as a Swede. Yeah, I mean, there may be certain signs, like they may have a Swedish first name, for example, or something that would indicate that. But yeah, this is sort of what ethnicity is. So it's not coterminous with some sort of notion of a pure genetic stock.
No.
Even though, of course, there's a correlation, since the people who have the identity are correlated with people who have the genetics. But over time, I think that will become a bit looser. But the point is, though, that the act of identifying with a group is very similar for minorities and majorities. And so, for example, if you look at U.S., Canada, Britain, again, where I've looked at this, if you identify very strongly as Irish or Italian in America, then you are much more likely to identify as white. That is going to be a more meaningful identity for you. It's a bit like saying, I identify as Swedish and as European. Now, the European will be a lower, less important identity than being Swedish, but still, it will, to the extent you tend to identify with ethnicity, then the pan-ethnic, the kind of wider layer of the onion, which is white, will also be more important for you than for someone for whom being Irish or Italian doesn't matter at all. And it's the same relationship for a Hispanic or Asian person. If you're really into being Chinese, you're more likely to be into being Asian. It's like, if I'm really into family, I'll be more into my extended family. So it's nothing sinister. It is simply a pattern. It's common to whites and non-whites alike. And yet, it's built up into this this terrible, sinister thing that's going to lead to Nazism and Jim Crow and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I think there's a whole lot of mythology that isn't based on any kind of systematic social science that goes into these catastrophizing narratives. There are some benefits to having the statistics, because you can then isolate exactly what is race from what is ethnicity in terms of, say, discrimination. How much is race, how much is religion, say anti-Muslim, how much is anti-foreign born, so these are useful, I think, just to isolate how much is one or the other. Now, I mean, the use of the term white in the U.S. sense, I think, is sociologically accurate, simply because, very few white Americans have just one ethnic background, like Irish or Italian or Swedish. They're all a mishmash. There's a few who are, but
the melting pot worked with the white identity,
right? And socially, in terms of who people marry, the kinds of things they do, the places they live, these pan-ethnic categories do work quite well. In other words, the ethnic neighborhoods of the Irish and the Italian, that's largely broken up and gone. The more relevant categories are these larger categories. Now, of course, there's a lot of mixing, particularly Hispanic and Asian intermarriage to white is happening, and so it's blurry around the edges, and maybe there will be this, I think there will be this kind of widening of the, it's not as though being Hispanic will count as white, but certainly being part Hispanic and part white, you probably will be white, or part Asian and part white, or even part black and part white. So I think that process is occurring, but I would say the way this would manifest itself, you occasionally see surveys that say, do you have to have Swedish ancestry to be a true Swede or a true Russian or a true British? And there you will see a larger number of people answering. So I think something like 50% of people in England said, you have to have some English ancestry to be English, or to be truly English. Now, what does that mean when someone says truly? Are they simply pointing to the fact that they recognize there's something called an ethnic Swede, let's say, and somebody who's a Swede by nationality and citizenship? It could just be that factually they draw a distinction between these. But I guess my point is, typically the ethnic Swedish identity will be expressed through a version of Swedish national identity that also includes things like ancestry as part of it. That's probably the way the majority identity is expressed in Sweden. But of course, there are going to be different competing versions of Swedish national identity. One will be multicultural and just based on Swedish values of being progressive. That will be one version of Swedish identity.
One thing that you brought up in White Shift, which I thought was very interesting as well, was that even though in Denmark, for example, and they are more conservative on immigration than Sweden is, and Sweden and Canada are more liberal, but the micro behavior to intermarriage and segregation is still similar. So you might have pay lip service sometimes to these bigger values, but you still self-segregate. And in Sweden we have had a school choice, so you have a school voucher and you bring that to the school, so you can track the segregation that people are self-segregating and moving away from schools that are more diverse.
Yes,
and right now we have a debate if we're going to bus people to mix the schools more. So that will be a test of people's values, because it's easy to pay lip service to some values. And also we've gone from lots of apartments which are rented to apartments that are bought and owned. And so you have segregation because of that as well, because as soon as apartments can be rented, it's more diverse. So you've had lots of movement, lots of self-segregating on part of the majority population in Sweden. At the same time, they can uphold their left modernist values, because they're actually not faced with the diversity that they've voted for.
Yeah, I mean, and what's really interesting is you see these common patterns across Western countries. Everywhere I've looked, you can look at, in Britain, where we have good ethnic data, although I've seen studies in Sweden that find exactly the same thing. What happens is that upwardly mobile minorities will often move to whiter areas, but whites will not move into heavily diverse areas. So once an area becomes very diverse, like some of the inner suburbs you talk about in Sweden, places here in London, like in the eastern part of the city, which are several hundred nationalities, but whites are a minority. Every census, the white British share drops lower and lower. Essentially, people don't tend to move there to start families. There is a small amount of gentrification close to the city center because they're formerly minority areas, but are proximal to the city center and are hip. And so there's the only place you see whites moving in. But so that pattern of these national segregation indices can look okay, because you're getting minorities moving into the white areas, but you're not getting whites moving into the minority areas. The two are offsetting. But if you really look at this closely, there's a lot of self-selection. And what's interesting is in Britain, we are able to look at the way Brexit voters and Remain voters, or left-wing voters and right-wing voters, where they move. And essentially, white liberals and white conservatives are moving to the same areas. There's almost no difference. So you're right. So the actual people's ideologies, whether they're pro or anti-immigration, doesn't seem to affect where they move. The white left is moving into the white areas at the same rates, and so and similarly with friendship groups, you see this same sort of segregation happening. So yeah, I think in terms of people's behavior, their behavior is kind of very ethno-nationalist in many ways. Not ethno-nationalist, but certainly very ethnic, majority ethnic, which belies their view that this is a toxic identity.
I recently read a study about the contact hypothesis. Like you have this hypothesis that if you come into contact with each other, like different groups, minority, majority, immigrant, native, then you will get a more positive view of each other. And this study was conducted by Bengt Magnus and Bengt Magnus Amot Bentsen. I'm sorry, all the Norwegians, that I can't pronounce your names. And it was published in the Journal of International Migration and Integration, the 14th of May this year. And it studied among intergroup contact and negative attitudes towards immigrants among youth in Sweden, individual and contextual factors. And it actually showed that if you have high quality contact, if you form friendships with immigrants, then the contact hypothesis holds. You get a more positive attitude, or less of a negative attitude among Swedish adolescents. But if you go to the same school or meet in the municipality, then it's actually correlated with a more negative attitude.
Right.
So I just say that this is just one study, and it's just one. But it's one of the main foundations of how this plays out, is that if we get to know each other and we move to live in the same areas, we go to the same schools, then we will have a more positive attitude towards each other. It's almost automatic when you hear this. But this indicates that at least it indicates that it might not be automatic.
Yeah, I mean it's very tricky, this whole area, to get the data that you see studies that are all over the place. I mean, again, we did this in the paper. We did a review of like 200 of these studies, and the pattern that we saw was that it is true that in your neighborhood, like say 1,000, 1,500 people, something like that, if it's more diverse, it looks like the white people in those more diverse areas are a bit more tolerant. But if you have diversity in your apartment block, that's associated with lower toleration. And if particularly when you've got diversity in your city or county or province, the more diverse your city, county, province is, generally the more anti-immigration you will be. So the typical configuration that would produce the most anti-immigration or support for populism is living in a relatively white neighborhood, or a relatively less diverse neighborhood within a diverse city, or living on the outskirts of a diverse city in a relatively white area. I mean, so the diversity actually leads to greater threat response. A bit like maybe the analogy of a nuclear power plant, where if you live right next to it, you kind of understand it. You're not so fearful. If you live very far away, you never think about it. But if you're just close enough that you could be affected, then you worry the most. So there is something to this contact argument. It's not, I think, a large effect. It has effects mainly at the neighborhood level, but certainly at the country, province, city level, county level, it cuts a different way. So I think I don't think that this is going to be something that leads to a great harmony. No.
No.
I think there's forces pushing in different directions.
Your description of it would describe how it's in the south of Sweden, around Malmö, the big city there, because it's I think now it's a minority majority city, and I think 2/3 of the youth there are have foreign-born parents or are themselves foreign-born.
Okay.
But if you look at the largest party in the south of Sweden, it's often Sweden Democrats in many parts of it. So people, the ethnic Swedes, many of them have moved from Malmö into the outer rim of Malmö. Maybe they work in Malmö because it's an economic hub, but they don't live there anymore. So it would describe that effect.
It's what's called the halo effect in the literature, and that's been picked up in cities from all over the place. I think it's Antwerp or was it Amsterdam, Montreal. If you look at the U.S. election for Trump, these exurbs around the major cities swung to Trump in 2016. So I think that is a common. In London here, it's the sort of what's called Essex and the Thames Gateway. Some of these areas just outside Greater London that had the strongest support for UKIP and the BNP and all these sorts of things. So it's a pretty common pattern.
Thank you so much, Eric Kaufmann, for being a part of this podcast.
Thanks, Ivar. It's been a great conversation and we covered a lot, so that's been fantastic.
Yeah, really good. Och tack till dig som har lyssnat. Har du några frågor eller synpunkter får du gärna mejla mig på ivar.arpi@gmail.com. Tack och hej!